said, my concern these days really, and my concern when writing the book as well, was to interrupt a mainstream discourse on Pakistan for the sake of, what I might say, the future of Pakistan and its people, but also really because of the role that Pakistan plays within the current sort of US imperialist project, and therefore the discourse that emerges within the mainstream, whether we're talking about the media or the academy around Pakistan. And so, as usual, what I'm going to do is try and offer a corrective to that discourse, and I'll talk through this paper. I'll flesh out some of the details of this discourse, but I think most of it is pretty familiar to you. Anyway, so without further ado, I shall begin. So we're now in our 13th year of the US-led global war on terror, which looks set to be a war without end, in the prescient words of a political commentator. What began as an invasion of Afghanistan to get bin Laden and those who sheltered him, namely the Taliban, it has morphed into something much bigger with domestic and international ramifications. Naturally, with this imperialist war has come an ideological project which aims to construct consent for it. The mainstay of this ideological project is a particular discourse around Islam, not just Islamic militancy or the Taliban, mind you, but Islam understood as a monolithic thing which is illiberal in its very essence. It is argued that this illiberalism is reflected in Islam's attitude towards women and sexual minorities, argued in the discourse, that is. Islam is thus projected within this discourse as uniquely misogynist and homophobic. I have argued elsewhere that it is this understanding of Islam which is responsible not just for the essentially bipartisan nature of the support for the war in the US, but also characterizes it as a liberal war. The ideological project which sustains this war relies not just on the usual suspects, national security experts within and outside the academy, of which of course there are plenty, but on scholars within the humanities, within the fields of anthropology, history, language, and literary studies, and of course gender and women's studies. And this is of course where South Asia studies also begins to play a role. Given the centrality of Pakistan within this war, scholars of South Asia also gain importance as regional experts. And in fact, scholars of Pakistan, and specifically Pakistani scholars, have come to play a very important role indeed, that of native informants. All of this makes it crucial for us to understand the history of the US's strategic relationship to Pakistan, which for most people means the US's proxy war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which created the Mujahideen and which eventually created the conditions for the Taliban's rise to power with the help of the Pakistani intelligence agencies. However, the story begins much earlier, and I think it is incumbent on us as scholars and politically engaged individuals to go beyond the headlines to understand it in its full complexity. It begins with the very early years of the Cold War, when the US found itself faced with a formidable foe in the form of the Soviet Union and world communism. It was the post-war period, and decolonization was in full swing. Most of the anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia had connections in terms of politics, ideology, or material support with the Soviet Union. Once these former colonies achieved independence, they naturally turned to the Soviet Union as a model for rapid growth and a source of foreign aid. Wary of the Soviet Union's special relationship with these new states, the US launched its own model for economic growth, and thus modernization theory was born. An ambitious cross-disciplinary intellectual project, it drew on expertise from across the social sciences in order to lay out a teleology of economic, political, social, and cultural change designed to bring the newly independent countries up to speed. It was through this Cold War ideological project that the first formal relationship between the US State Department and the US Academy developed. The creation of area studies was, of course, one crucial aspect of this relationship. And for those of you who are not aware of that history, since I realized when I step outside of the US that my work is very US-centric, partly because I'm constantly addressing the US state and its intellectuals. So I'm not sure how South Asia Studies was established in the Canadian Academy, but in the US it was part of this sort of Cold War project of area studies. And South Asia wasn't really of much strategic importance within the academy for the US state. It was mostly East Asia and Southeast Asia. So particularly in the 1960s and 70s with the wars in Korea and Vietnam. Modernization theory was only one part of the ideological project of the Cold War, however. The other involved the deployment of an international liberal front against communism, exemplified in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This front included prominent writers, poets, and artists, as well as social scientists and other academics, and was a crucial part of the US's cultural Cold War. Since many of the newly independent states were Muslim or had significant Muslim populations, the cultural Cold Warriors decided that Islam should be used as a bulwark against godless communism, as a way to sort of argue to these Muslim populations that going with the Soviet Union was essentially going against Islam. All these developments had major implications for Pakistan, which was one of the newly independent states coveted at this time by the US. Of course, India was the real prize within South Asia, but at this time Nehru's non-aligned stance infuriated the US. Very soon after independence, the political establishment in Pakistan began to make overtures to the US. After all, the interests of the two coincided. The Pakistani establishment at the time, composed of an alliance of the civil and military bureaucracies and the landed elite, was deeply anti-communist and anti-democrat, and had already, with the help of prominent anti-communist liberal intellectuals, begun to crack down on left-wing intellectuals and dissidents, painting them as nothing less than seditious. It was thus appropriate that the year in which the US and Pakistan signed the first of many mutual defense and security pacts, 1954, was also the year in which the Pakistani civil bureaucracy consolidated its power with the dismissal of the Constituent Assembly by the Governor General, and the year in which the Communist Party of Pakistan, along with many other organizations declared to be its fronts, such as the Progressive Writers Association, was banned and prominent leftist intellectuals and activists jailed. This fruitful relationship between the Pakistani establishment and the US was to continue throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The US supported, and by many accounts aided, the military coup of 1958, which brought the military under General Ayub Khan into formal political power in Pakistan. This pattern of supporting authoritarian and in particular military dictators was to repeat itself several times over the course of Pakistani history, with major implications for the Pakistani people. And this penchant of the US for dictators was formally enshrined in modernization theory, with Cold War social scientists defining the military in third world countries as a progressive force. Of course, the real issue was that these militaries were important Cold War assets for the US, being quintessentially anti-democratic, but also extremely powerful, especially with US help. So Ayub Khan cracked down immediately after coming into power on left-wing forces, but he also launched a quintessentially Cold War social engineering project to aid in the marginalization of left-wing intellectuals and left-wing ideas in Pakistan. So one prong of this social engineering project was the institutionalization of a development project under the aegis of Cold War social scientists from Harvard, and two, an ideological attack through cultural institutions designed to create a critical mass of establishment intellectuals who were naturally anti-left. One of the things worth noting about this period of the Cold War in Pakistan is that the ruling establishment, military and otherwise, was socially liberal and avowedly secular. However, this did not preclude their deploying the rhetoric of Islam and often using the services of the Jamaat-e-Islami, the major Islamist party at the time, against their major opponents who were left-wing and therefore also secular. This dovetailed nicely with the US's Cold War strategy of using Islam to defeat the appeal of communism among Muslims. And so when push came to shove and Ayub Khan found himself facing a massive national leftist pro-democracy movement in the mid-1960s, he and his secular liberal establishment intellectuals joined hands with the intellectuals of the Jamaat-e-Islami. As it turned out, this move was unsuccessful because the movement was far too strong. However, the story of how this leftward shift in Pakistani politics was undermined and ultimately defeated, first by Bhutto and then by Ziaul Haq, cannot be told now, but suffice it to say that the 1970s and 1980s was a period of major right-wing consolidation in Pakistan. The difference was that under Ziaul Haq, this right wing was no longer a liberal right wing. Zia's 1977 coup was deeply unpopular, not least because of the draconian nature of the regime, which unleashed a reign of terror against dissidents, especially those with any left-wing associations. The main project of this regime was to cleanse Pakistan of the twin viruses of socialism and secularism. This Zia planned to accomplish successfully, as it turned out, in large degree, through a project of Islamization. Of course, one of the other ways in which he accomplished this was learning the lessons from the previous decades of Pakistani history. He completely destroyed the university as a base for the exchange or transmission of radical left-wing democratic ideas. And so universities in Pakistan and colleges in Pakistan were nationalized, their curriculum was centralized, and any sort of political dissidence at all was brutally punished. And this has implications for progressive politics in Pakistan and the kinds of intellectual work that you see coming out of Pakistan today. Luckily for Zia, the US, which had distanced itself in previous years, once more came to require the services of the Pakistani military, just as the resistance to his regime was beginning to build. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So Zia, with this Soviet invasion, the Pakistani military establishment went from being a pariah on the world stage to being the US's most valued and strategic Cold War ally. This relationship between the US and Pakistan through the proxy war in Afghanistan had major implications for Pakistani society. The Afghan war ripped apart the already fragile social fabric of Pakistani society. Significant among the consequences of the war was the rise of the shadowy and powerful inter-services intelligence, the ISI, whose current notoriety and power within Pakistan is a direct result of the role it played in the conflict, funneling arms and money from the US, China, and Saudi Arabia to the Mujahideen. The ISI also patronized and protected the parallel shadow economy in arms and drugs produced by the war, and Pakistan became one of the main conduits for the international trade in heroin during this period. The easy availability of guns and drugs in Pakistan as a consequence of this illegal war economy led to a rise in criminality at all levels of society. Heroin addiction soared among the poor and unemployed, while gun violence permeated every aspect and level of society, transforming the very nature of social conflict in Pakistan and decisively changing the rules of the political game from this point on. Along with enabling the increased militarization of Pakistani culture and society, the Afghan war furthered the process of the Islamization of the military and crucially resulted in a militarization of Islam. In fact, the use of Islam as a chosen ideology for the Mujahideen in their battle with the godless communists was the apotheosis of the US's Cold War deployment of Islamic radicals as a counter to international communism. This militarized and militant version of Zia's Islam was disseminated to recruits for the jihad against the Soviet Union via not only the now notorious madrasa set up by the army and the ISI with the help of the CIA, but also through the mainstream educational channels. The construction and popularization of a hyper-masculinized and militarized version of Islam was as part and parcel of Zia's Islamization project. So there were other ways in which the period of the 1980s really changed the political terrain in Pakistan in terms of this rightward shift. And I'll come to that again when I begin to talk about Pakistani intellectuals and the kinds of frameworks that they deploy and the interests that they represent. So cut to September 2001, and pretty much the same story is repeated with the US attack on Afghanistan in October and the reversal of fortune of yet another Pakistani military dictator. However, things had changed in the decade or so since the last war in Afghanistan. For one, Islam had now replaced communism as the enemy of the free world. Throughout the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, a new set of establishment experts had arisen, spread across media, academia, and think tanks, with direct and indirect links to the State Department. These establishment intellectuals were really the precursors of today's Islamophobia industry. And their main ideologue, of course, was Bernard Lewis, along with Samuel Huntington. And throughout the 1990s, then you see this sort of build up within academia and, of course, within mainstream media as well, of the threat of Islamic militancy and Islamic fundamentalism and this particular kind of Islamophobic discourse. Thus, when the US needed to mobilize support for its attack on Afghanistan in October 2001, and in fact for the continued occupation of Afghanistan as well as the spread of US contingency operations over the next decade or so, it could fall back on this already available and neatly packaged discourse on Islam's essentially illiberal nature. Even the cynical use of Afghan women by the Bush administration relied on established tropes about the status of women under Islam. In the 12 plus years since that initial attack, which inaugurated this new phase of US imperialist expansion, this discourse has metastasized. The election of Obama only served to clarify the essentially bipartisan nature of the support for this imperialist expansion, as I said before. In fact, with Obama's election, US liberals have come to openly own the war on terror, in no small part because of their deeply held beliefs about the danger posed by Islam to liberal values. With Obama's election, we also saw a change in the US attitude towards Pakistan, which accompanied an expansion of the Afghanistan war into Pakistan via CIA drone strikes and enabled by the coining of a new strategic term, AFPAC. This new phase was accompanied by a predictable and necessary shift in tone in the US discourse on Pakistan, which had never been entirely sympathetic in tone, even during the era of the Musharraf-Bush alliance. With this shift, the role of Pakistani experts, particularly those with liberal and feminist credentials, also became important. So in the mainstream media, the discourse on Pakistan, never laudatory to begin with, shifted dramatically as Pakistan went from being an ally predicated on its status as a crucial frontline state for imperial adventures old and new, to being a liability. Terms like rogue state, failed state, and of course, everyone's personal favorite, the most dangerous place in the world, are the words routinely used to describe it. The coverage of Pakistan in the US media reveals only bearded men and mentions generally only militants when it's not talking about the Pakistani military. You would be hard-pressed to find a single human interest story on Pakistan in the pages of the mainstream media, and certainly not one which is not in some way connected to Islam and militancy. So even when you see the odd story on Pakistan, which is not directly connected to the war, it is always already framed by Islam, and in particular Islamic militancy. So one example is a short piece that the New York Times featured on some very deep, of course, within the New York Times, on a fashion show in Pakistan. And as those of us who frequent Pakistan know, fashion shows are not an oddity. And neither are they necessarily done, sort of under threat. Although, of course, now with the general sort of security environment in Pakistan being heightened, everything comes with a security threat. But the entire tone of the article, and in fact, the sort of framing of the article was about how courageous these people were to hold a fashion show in Pakistan. The example I have is a story, and this was actually, I think, a front page story on a small, sort of almost family-run enterprise that produced lingerie for Victoria's Secret or some other well-known, maybe even Frankies of Hollywood. And the entire piece was sort of written in this salacious style about, these men and women in repressed Pakistan producing lingerie, right? So this is sort of the general tenor of what you get through the mainstream sort of media, is this sense of this deeply pathological society, very repressed, totally, with this very small group of moderate Muslims and liberals who are constantly under attack, like literal and figurative attack, right? So the result of all this framing is that the mainstream discourse on Pakistan and the average reader of even the New York Times sees only militants and jihadis, madrasas and the Taliban. As Ejaz Ahmed notes, how long has it been since Western TV audiences saw anything about Pakistan which was not connected with Islam or dictatorship? Are there workers in Pakistan, peasants in Pakistan? The work of foregrounding and occlusion are almost magical. Certainly what emerges about Pakistan from these media accounts, and also, as I'll touch on a little bit, also within sort of the US Academy at least, is that this is a country that is devoid of culture, it is devoid of history, and it can really be represented purely by referencing religious militancy. So in all of this is all presented to us as a historic inevitability, given Pakistan's essential Muslimness. And this is something that vibes very easily with sort of mainstream views of Pakistan within the South Asia field as well. What comes across is a telos of terror and self-destruction. In all of this, the role of the Cold War and its aftermath in creating this situation is conspicuously missing, because of course that would spoil the telos. And this, of course, the US interests in Pakistan, security interests in Pakistan, also have implications for who gets to speak about Pakistan, right? And also, of course, what kinds of things get said. So we have the creation of a new generation of sort of establishment intellectuals. So, like I said, this sort of mainstream media representation of Pakistan, dovetails very nicely and very neatly with the attitude towards Pakistan within sort of South Asia studies, at least within the US, where within the historiography of the subcontinent, dominated as it is by Indianists, the establishment of Pakistan is seen as the culmination of an essentially religious movement which destroyed the secular fabric of India. The problems that Pakistan faces today, particularly the rise of religious extremism, are thus presumed to be the poisonous fruit of this flawed foundation, with parallels often being drawn with Israel, which is identified as the only other modern state established on the basis of religion. And so you have books referring to Pakistan as the Muslim Zion, right? Which completely obviously rely on this flattened kind of teleology and way of understanding Pakistan, which of course does not take into account the ways in which even the militancy is really a product of this long US relationship with the Pakistani military establishment. Okay. So what happened though with this turn towards Pakistan and the need for these experts, you had a reinvestment in certain kinds of knowledge production. In particular, of course, knowledge that would, of course, serve the security interests of the US state. And so you had money pouring back into area studies for language instruction in languages considered of particular interest to the US military, of which Urdu is one. I don't know why they think Urdu is necessary, but I guess it makes it easier for them to go around in Pakistan, but certainly Pashto, Dari, and other such languages. You also, of course, see a new sort of focus on Pakistan initiatives within South Asia centers, which of course do not come with any permanent tenure track lines. So you have this sort of revolving door of visiting professors and visiting experts who are very much, who very much represent the interests of the US state. And I looked up actually one of the recent Pakistan initiatives at the university at Berkeley, and predictably its faculty consists of one language instructor. Of course, instructors don't have tenure in Urdu. One national security expert who's not in actually the security studies field, at Berkeley, and also has connections, which he proudly, sort of advertises, with a US military contractor. And you have sundry other faculty picked from other parts of the academy, none of which really have any expertise on Pakistan, right? And this is very symptomatic of the way in which sort of knowledge about Pakistan is cobbled together. Given this, then, the importance of Pakistani intellectuals becomes even more front and center, especially because they come with this sort of veneer of authenticity, right? And these often with this, the street creds of having been activists, having first been betrayed by the Prime Minister Zede Bhutto. It was decisively decimated during the US-supported military regime of Zia-ul-Haq. Whatever remained of it after Zia self-combusted following the fall of the Soviet Union. As a result, the political space within Pakistan became divided between the liberals and the religious right, which, as far as we are concerned, should really both be considered right-wing forces, with the liberals sort of standing in for progressive politics to court, right? So the kinds of, social imagination, political imagination, and knowledge that a particular generation of Pakistani scholars in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and even through the 80s, such as Hamza Alavi, who I was very honored to have been in the same sentence as, and also Hassan Gardezi and Iqbal Ahmed, now has disappeared. Largely because these individuals have died, but also because you're having a generational shift, right? So you have an entire, I think now 2 generations, if I count myself as one of the generations, and it's true, I really did grow up under Zia-ul-Haq. So you have 2, maybe even 3 generations of young people who have been brought up in an environment in which the left is not a viable political force in Pakistan, and left-wing ideas are not available, right? All of that is sort of shifting now, and I'm happy to see that, but really very slowly, and we're very, very much in the minority. So this selective amnesia within liberal discourse has had major consequences for Pakistan after the end of the Zia regime in the late 1980s. The 1990s was a period, as I said, of right-wing consolidation in Pakistan, from neoliberalism in the economic and political spheres to an increase in the influence and power of the religious right within Pakistani society. An important and not often told part of the story of neoliberalism in Pakistan was the NGOization of progressive politics. Many of the elite liberal and some leftist intellectuals and activists who had been part of the anti-Zia movement established their own development, human rights, or women's rights NGOs. Mass political work of the sort associated with the organized left was abandoned in favor of project-based work tied to the demands of the international development and human rights industries. And this really also became, since the universities had been destroyed as centers of scholarship, real scholarship, these think tanks and these kinds of NGOs really became the spaces through which a particular kind of so-called progressive scholarship in Pakistan was also produced, right? Which then becomes circulated. This exacerbated the divide between liberal civil society activists and the vast majority of the Pakistani people, especially within the context of intensifying inequality. At the same time, the forces of religious conservatism and militancy unleashed during the Zia era continued to gain ground. The Taliban takeover in Afghanistan amplified liberal Pakistani fears, and liberal discourse in Pakistan, already focused on secularism to the exclusion of all other issues, became almost exclusively obsessed with the imminent Talibanization of Pakistan. And now I'm talking about the 1990s, when I was working with several feminist NGOs, and it was really sort of quite striking how this word Talibanization was sort of used to reference everything from someone's decision to take the hijab to actual sort of fallouts of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan in terms of the ISI's role in fomenting militancy in Pakistan. However, predictably, these fears did not result in ideological political work at the mass level. Even concern for the safety and rights of religious minorities did not translate into more than seminars, reports, and press releases. it became clear that the confrontational politics of the Zia era were an aberration, as liberals once more showed their preference for a politics of accommodation with the state, punctuated by small symbolic protests and demonstrations. And those of us who were working in Pakistan at the time would derisively refer to this as NGO politics, right? Issues of direct relevance to the everyday lives of most Pakistanis, such as the passage of draconian anti-terror laws, and there's been a recent ordinance as of this week that has been passed, used against labor leaders and striking workers and political dissidents, the downsizing and informalization of labor, and the need for land distribution were largely ignored. Even now, neoliberalism has not entered the lexicon of Pakistani liberal intellectuals and civil society activists. And throughout this entire decade, when neoliberalism was being consolidated in Pakistan, and in fact globalization was sort of the buzzword, you never once heard the word globalization or neoliberalism in any of these spaces. There was literally no concern with it. The marginalization of the left from politics and public discourse in Pakistan and liberal abandonment of issues and political positions such as class politics, anti-imperialism, and third world solidarity made it easy for these to be co-opted in a highly corrupt form, of course, by the religious right. This in turn made it less and less likely for these cornerstones of leftist politics to be taken up by liberals. Those who still choose to speak in the language of a principled left anti-imperialism, especially with regard to the AFPAC war, are routinely denounced as closet Taliban supporters. That includes yours truly. The unconditional support for this war among Pakistani liberals, including for Pakistani military operations in tribal regions, is not unprecedented, of course. Liberals, as I've tried to explain in a very abbreviated form, in Pakistan have shown a predilection for authoritarianism, which is connected to essentially a deep-rooted fear of the illiberal masses, right? These internal contradictions of Pakistani liberalism and the opportunism of NGO-based civil society politics became clear after General Pervez Musharraf deposed the government of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a military coup in 1999. Pakistani liberals had begun to feel threatened by the Nawaz Sharif government, which, in addition to working on passing a Shariat bill in the National Parliament, had launched a campaign of harassment against human rights and women's rights NGOs in the Punjab. As a result, Pakistani liberals, particularly civil society activists, welcomed the secular Musharraf almost like a messiah. Many of these prominent members of Pakistani civil society then went on to join Musharraf's cabinet, and the Pakistani military became part of the liberal mainstream in Pakistan until a national level movement against Musharraf led by lawyers changed the political game. The most heartening aspect of this movement against Musharraf was the breaking of a long period of political apathy and the emergence of an explicitly anti-military politics among a younger generation of urban Pakistanis. And I trace this in part to this younger generation's disillusionment with the Pakistani military in the aftermath of the earthquake in 2005, when many of them well-meaning young people worked very hard towards earthquake relief efforts, and they came sort of in daily contact with the Pakistani military, which was coordinating those relief efforts. And so they saw the sort of corruption within the military and the ways in which the military basically saw the military's anti-people sort of aspects. However, it was not long before the threat of a Taliban takeover and a concern with women's rights once again resulted in liberals embracing the military as savior. Despite some initial hiccups, Musharraf had joined the global war on terror, and like all military dictators in Pakistan before him, ultimately came to enjoy a cozy relationship with the US administration. Obama's election and the resulting refocusing of American attention on the good war in Afghanistan shattered this relationship. And Pakistan began to come under increasing fire within the US media for not doing enough in the battle against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. However, the war continued to be unpopular with the Pakistani public, and the newly elected PPP government was reluctant to squander its newly minted populist and anti-military credentials. American pressure on Pakistan reached a critical point in the early part of 2009 when a cell phone video allegedly showing Taliban fighters in Swat flogging a young woman began circulating within liberal circles in Pakistan, and then was, of course, predictably picked up by the international media. At the same time, reports that the Taliban were only 60 minutes from Islamabad began to appear within Pakistani English language newspapers. It did not take long for these two news items to have the desired result of mobilizing liberal opinion for a military operation in Swat. This operation displaced over 2 million people, and reports of serious human rights abuses by intelligence agencies and the military soon appeared, but neither produced any soul-searching among supporters of the operation, nor a disavowal of the military as an agent of secularism. In fact, insofar as any ambiguity exists within liberal circles with regard to such army operations, it does not amount to more than a sense that they are, like the military itself, a necessary evil. The military's relationship with the Taliban, however complex and contradictory it may be, is well documented and well known. Justification for drone attacks and military operations against the people of the tribal areas is sustained by claims backed up by dubious social science research that strong support exists for drone attacks among people in KPK and in the Waziristan. And arguments, this is far more problematic, arguments that draw a moral and in fact a literal equivalence between suicide bombers and militarized drones. And I refer here specifically to Dr. Pervez Hoodboy's article, Drones, Theirs and Ours, right? In which that equivalence is made, is that drones, US drones, or whether they're deployed by the CIA or deployed by the Pakistani army in these militant areas, are really the only answer to the drones produced by Islamic militancy, right? i.e. the suicide bombers. So drones and suicide bombers are somehow the same thing. Pakistani liberal support for drone strikes has remained strong even in the face of a shift in world public opinion against them, and a recognition that they are far from surgical in their precision. Behind this intransigence lies not just anxiety over Talibanization, but a deep-rooted and almost Orientalist ethno-racism against the people of the tribal areas who appear in liberal Pakistani discourse only as barbaric others. Within this discourse, all tribal men, especially those of North and South Waziristan, are assumed to be either actual or imminent militants and therefore legitimate military targets. Again, this dovetails very neatly with the US's recent sort of definition of militants as, of anyone who is killed in these drone strikes as militants unless posthumously proved to be otherwise, right? So therefore, it is hardly surprising that the recent revelation that the US State Department considers all men of military age within regions targeted by drones to be militants did not excite much comment within the Pakistani liberal universe, and certainly did not result in any condemnation of what amounts to collective punishment. And one other sort of phase of this sort of liberal ideological justification for military strikes against militants came with the attack last year against the Taliban attack on Malala Yousafzai, right, the young girl from Swat. And just to make the connection that exists within the Pakistani sort of liberal mindset between the need to save women and girls like Malala from these Islamic militants, and the drone strikes. One of the posters held up by people at a vigil for Malala said, "Drones kill so Malala can live." Really, so you see how sort of this kind of ideological justification for drone strikes in Pakistan is sort of built on the back of saving Muslim girls and Muslim women from Islamic militants, right? The FADA region, of course, is a no-go zone for anyone from the outside, especially journalists, and so independent verification of the claims made by the Pakistani military and the US State Department has been difficult. However, families of drone victims have gained some visibility within Pakistan and internationally through the work of Pakistani lawyers and through the work of UK-based human rights organization Reprieve. And of course, the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, who also released their own numbers of civilians killed by these drone strikes, decisively challenging the US claim that only militants have been killed in these strikes. However, Pakistani liberal support for drone strikes has remained strong even in the face of a shift in world public opinion against them. Given these politics and the fact that their class position allows them to dominate the English language media in Pakistan and thereby gain an international profile, it is not surprising that they are also overrepresented in the mainstream and even the alternative media in the United States. that is when Pakistani voices are deemed necessary in the conversation around the war in Afghanistan, thus establishing their role as native informants in the current phase of imperialism. And so what you see now is actually in the last few years of this ongoing US war of terror is the mobilization of not just a liberal front, but a left liberal front, which again is deeply invested in discourses of Islamophobia, sometimes shockingly explicit in their in their racism. And these discourses are coming out of scholars with very good credentials in terms of their previous politics. They have, they have long history of leftist politics within the United States, and many of them, of course, come with the authenticity of being Muslim feminists themselves, right? And so there are now a number of Pakistani feminists that are starting to appear on the academic circuit within the United States to sort of counter the kind of critique of the war on imperialism that some of us are sort of trying to articulate within the US. So, because I never like to end on a downer, I do want to note that, as I said, part of the problem is that there are very few voices that actually are willing and able to counter this sort of mainstream discourse in Pakistan, and particularly in Pakistan itself, for reasons that I hope I managed to explain, these historical reasons through which an entire sort of 20, 30 years, for something like 30 years now, young people in Pakistan have effectively grown up without any access to left-wing ideas. Of course, the internet has changed that, and one of the fallouts of the war on terror was that with the sweeps that were happening in the US, where Muslim men were being picked up and detained, and because of the general rise in Islamophobia within the US, many people, including scholars, elected to move back to Pakistan. And this was also at the time when, under Musharraf, the institutes of higher education that had been nationalized under Zia were being denationalized and privatized, right? So now you have part of the story that didn't emerge from what I just said, is that you now have these private universities and colleges that are connected very deeply in terms of networks to the US Academy and of course to the US State Department. So, but interestingly, one of the unexpected fallouts of that is that these have also become spaces where left-wing scholars can actually or have managed to find a place. And so you are beginning to see a new generation of Pakistani journalists, young people, journalists and activists who are sort of reversing, hopefully, this situation in which the only people who get to speak for Pakistan, whether it's within Pakistan or outside, are these sort of liberal ideologues of empire. So, thank you.
Well, I agree with
the opinion polls. I'm not referencing any polls per se.
Well, you made comments stating that there's wide support for drone attacks, or you made sweeping comments about the Pakistani liberal class, who I agree with you to a certain degree that liberals are the scum of the earth. But I want to, I would like just on a general.
You're asking what the empirical basis of my claim is.
Exactly.
Right. So it's not based on any polls, because as far as I know, no one has done any polls of this sort, right? What it's based on is a very close eye that people like me tend to keep on the discourse that emerges from Pakistan. And it's not very difficult to do, right? There's only 2, maybe 3 English language newspapers. There's not that many prominent intellectuals. We know them, we follow them. These things get, sort of circulated through social media. They get brought up in every conversation you have about Pakistan. It's kind of hard to avoid them, right? So, and it's also very obvious what the reaction to a counter narrative is within the spaces of that. I mean, having written for Pakistani newspapers myself and having seen what happens to other people. And in fact, even when you don't write for Pakistani newspapers, because the fact is that I'm not writing as this sort of disinterested, objective scholar looking at this interesting sort of phenomenon, right? I'm speaking as somebody who's deeply imbricated in this battle of ideas that's taking place right now, right? And I have a very deep investment in what happens, and as does everybody, right? It's just that everybody's investments are different, right? And what you've started to see now emerge is a critique of ideas like mine. And that critique is emerging from specific feminist intellectuals in Pakistan using this discourse of authenticity. This is the really interesting thing. So there are references made to diaspora intellectuals, right? Now these are people who come on state-funded trips to Pakistan, speak at Columbia University, right, are feted by everyone, and then they go back and, or while they're here, sort of speak derisively about anyone who criticizes the US war in Afghanistan and Pakistan as basically being elites who are out of touch with reality, right? Which I find really interesting. And, I don't know if it helps to name names, but Akbar Zaidi, a political economist who I used to respect very highly, and I've used his sort of work, his actual political economy stuff in my own work, is one of these people, and he wrote this scathing and really nasty op-ed in, I think it was Dawn a few months ago, in response to a film on Waziristan called Wounds of Waziristan. I strongly encourage people to watch it. I think it's available on the web. Made by a friend of mine who is a freelance journalist who, and a young woman who, spent a lot of time in Pakistan talking to drone survivors, talking to lawyers working with drone survivors, and really that short film is her effort to counter the narrative on Waziristan, right? By allowing the people themselves to speak, which never happens. People speak for them, and people magically appear that claim to be from Waziristan, don't live there anymore, so it's, I guess, easy to make certain kinds of claims about what's going on there. And I encourage you to read that op-ed. It is so malevolent about a short film that is doing nothing except sort of showcasing a group of people who are written out of the narrative in the US and in Pakistan, right? And he does it by talking about them as elite, privileged, right? This is a man who sits in Columbia University, right? And good for Madiha, she actually wrote an op-ed in response to that, in which she called him out on his privilege. So this is this is a very active battle that's going on as we speak, right? So this morning, someone sent me an article that Akbar Zaidi has written in Economic and Political Weekly, which apparently again goes off on me. So I did not have the energy to read that before giving this talk, but that's probably going to be what I'll do after I have a couple of drinks tonight. So I mean, I don't want to romanticize this idea of being on the front lines, fighting the good fight. It's not a fun task, right? Because it's ultimately a really small community. And it's not pleasant to have people sort of, say nasty things about you. But, being that as it may, the fact of the matter is that I don't know how really, but I really was brought up in through various influences, largely my father, again through the Zia era, to think that speaking truth to power was something that one needed to do, not just for other people, but for oneself, right? So, that's what I try to do in my modest little way. But it's amazing how, even a small attempt at a counter narrative produces this barrage of response, So that sort of hopefully goes back to your question about where I'm getting this sense of this, this liberal discourse. It's sort of unescapable, honestly.
I thought it was really interesting how you said that the liberalization of like academic institutions in Pakistan is actually giving space for leftist ideas. I mean, within the context of say Canada and globally, there isn't a lot of space and a lot of breadth for leftist ideas. I mean, some would argue since the fall of the Soviet Union, there hasn't really been anywhere leftist ideas have flourished. This question of like, how does it relate to like the American academia? You're saying that like American academics are going back to Pakistan and kind of giving kind of an embryonic base for.
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm sorry if that's the image it conveyed, but there's now what has happened is that because of these different things processes that happen before. Before the privatization of these institutions, it was just impossible to have any discussions, any scholarly discussions within what could pass for Pakistani academic spaces, right? Like I said, the only so-called scholarship that was produced within think tanks, within NGOs, or by people in NGOs for either the NGO circuit within Pakistan or outside Pakistan. And so a lot of the pieces on Pakistan and Pakistani women written from the 1980s onwards in journals of women's studies or development will be written by people who are part of that NGO circuit, right? So you have to read them with that in mind. I'm not saying many of them are well-meaning, right? But there is a particular sort of set of blinders that they wear, and there is a particular way in which this kind of the kind of neoliberal turn that politics took in Pakistan, with this turn to human rights and women's rights in particular kinds of ways through the NGO circuit, produced, right? What is happening with these new spaces? It's not as if these institutions are happy to have these people. And the individuals are really like, you can count them probably on the fingers of one hand, right? But students respond very well, by and large, to not everyone, because if you are truly progressive in the Pakistani context, you are going to not just be critical of the US role in Pakistan, but of the Pakistani establishment itself, right? And there lies the rub. So you have a whole generation of young people who are very nationalist, even though they have these sort of liberal ideas as well. And so for them, their national identity is sort of caught up in this defensiveness, right? So when you confront them with, of course, they're happy to hear about the critique of the US, but then when you confront them with the critique of the Pakistani military or the Pakistani National Project or things like that, there is a certain dissonance. And then there's a flip side as well. Many people want to hear the critique of the Pakistani military and the Pakistani establishment, but don't want to hear the critique of the US and its role in Pakistan. So it's always a very fine line, and it's very tough to walk that line. But people are so far managing to do that, I think, mostly under the radar.
In what ways are they conscious of their own implications in a elite liberal class? Because I would imagine that a number of them, while choosing left-leaning politics, come out of the same circuit of, they hang out with the same people, they go to the same universities, they make a lot of choices about why they want to go back home. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering what are the kinds of conversations that they're having that might be a little different to really push the boundaries about their own positionality, and what are the ways and what are some of the things that you think they would need to discuss in order to push these left-leaning thinkers out of their own positions of privilege?
Okay, so there's two varieties of self-avowed leftists in Pakistan, okay? Not people that I might necessarily consider leftists. So they're leftists who actually very much walk the liberal line when it comes to the war in Afghanistan. So they'll do all the other left stuff, but when it comes to the issue of the war and the necessity for military operations, will walk that line, right? Where I'm not particularly concerned with those because they sort of feed the same beast, let's say, right? But then there is, the people I'm talking about are people who actually don't necessarily all come from the same elite class background. That's one thing, right? Even though they may have ended up going to elite institutions. So for example, LUMS, which has really emerged in this bizarre way. LUMS is the Lahore University of Management Sciences, right? So it, at some point, the person who established it is of a philanthropic sort of bent of mind, and an established industrialist in Pakistan, decided that there should be a humanities and social science school as well. And this was at a time when really there was no other institute of higher education serving that need. So it was very underfunded, and it really, when I was there for my field work, it was essentially run by ABDs from the US and Canada, right? People like me, I was an ABD, right? And that's what they were doing, right? They had a bunch of young, minds to mold, and they came with like really, interesting ideas from the academy that nobody in Pakistan was engaging with or interested in, and nobody was watching them because they were so small, right, and so insignificant within this larger sort of universe. Then over time, that part of LUMS, the College of Arts and Sciences or Social Sciences and Humanities, whatever it calls itself, has become much bigger and more established. And with that, of course, has gone, some of that autonomy that they used to have. But in the meantime, I think, and I haven't really spent a lot of time sort of figuring out where these people, sort of young people, popped up from. But many of them have links to LUMS in one way or the other. So one is that LUMS does have some fellowships that allow young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend LUMS, and I think they bring obviously a certain kind of consciousness and approach that has been missing. And that, of course, I didn't get to talk about this, but that was really the reason why radicalism arose in Pakistani universities as anywhere else, right? Because Pakistani universities, particularly the public universities like Punjab University, for example, really became the place where people like members of the elite could sit side by side with people from the further sort of small village or town of Punjab, right? And that produced that just that engagement, plus of course it's the 1960s, and you also have access to this worldwide kind of revolutionary set of ideas, right, and movements that kind of enabled that sort of cross-class kind of mobilization to occur. And the right wing in Pakistan saw that, and they put an end to it, right? So now with this neoliberal university, aside from these very small exceptions, you do have the reinscription of class, right? Which oddly enough, with the nationalization that happened under Zia, like one of the good aspects of the nationalization under Zia was that once again, all universities in Pakistan, not just the public universities, were nationalized. So anybody could go anywhere, right? And so I went to Keynote College for Women, which is considered an incredibly elite institution, but I didn't feel very elite when I was there because there were people from all classes there. Really, it all boiled down to how well you scored on these national exams, right? Of course, that didn't mean that it was not predominantly full of liberal girls, but because it was a girls' college. But it was very different from what I see now when I go back to Pakistan, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. I think they are actually very aware because the people that I have run into they're pretty humble, and they are very conscious of whatever privilege they carry, whether it's a class privilege or a privilege of education or whatever it is. And that doesn't mean that that makes it easier to cross the immense class divides in Pakistan, but people, they are, and this is the other thing that happens with this sort of particular kind of security lens through which Pakistan is seen, right? Is that only things that are of interest to the security establishment emerge, and there's no interest, no investment in seeing what is actually going on the ground in Pakistan. So there are people's movements everywhere, right? they're being, attacked by the state, left, right, and center. But that has not stopped them, and that's been Pakistan's history from the very beginning, right? And I think that's what I was really, really invested in, sort of rescuing and sharing, was this history of resistance in Pakistan, which just, I did not grow up hearing about this, it's not even. And when I started doing my research, I was shocked and actually really angry, because I discovered that people who had been my teachers and my mentors in the places that I had worked, for example, had been part of those movements. And yet I never heard about the sort of depth and the breadth of the kinds of politics that were going on in the 1960s and even the 1950s, and people are now, so I'm very much part, I think, of a small group of people that is trying to document that history, right? So there are others who are also have done archival work on leftist movements in the 50s and 60s and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff now available in terms of documents and reflections by older members of those movements on the internet, which really wasn't the case, when I was doing my work, which is, all of that I think contributes to kind of puncturing that dominant discourse in some way.
Professor Toor, you awaken the nostalgic feeling of living in Pakistan with your own history telling. But one thing I did hear in your lecture about role of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in Pakistan.
Absolutely.
And how they changed the Islamized and very extremistly Islamized the mind. The time when you were in 1990s, you were working in NGOs. I was working in Islamabad in NGOs as well. So we were liberals, we were pro-Sufis, we used to go to Sufi shrines, and we were left-wing. So usually left-wing people were religious as well as, but very liberal and left-wing oriented. Now, the left wing, last month I was in Pakistan, I was with the same friends in Islamabad, and I realized when we were talking in Damanico in a very posh restaurant, and I saw when they were talking, so they tried to peek that who is sitting behind. So this is the mindset now. People are scared of this pro-Saudi Qatar mind, which actually destroyed our Sufi culture. Left was a lot in Sindh province. Left was so flourishing in southern Punjab. But now we are scared of this Taliban approach. So this is my comment. I don't know how now you are telling me that left is flourishing in some elite universities.
No, I did not mean to imply that the left is flourishing anywhere in Pakistan.
That's true.
No.
That's true. So I used to see left in very low class, in labor class, when we used to wear red shirt on the first day on Labor Day, and the flag of red flag. But now this is not there.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're dismissed as these naive people, either naive people or dangerous people, But I think what you're saying. I completely agree with that, and I've fleshed that out in my book and in other pieces I've written. I didn't have. I had to make decisions about what to cut out in a talk of this length. But definitely, I mean, part of Zia's Islamization project involved these deep connections to Saudi and Gulf money, and therefore the influence of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates in Pakistani political and social life. And that is really part of the story of how that rightward shift in Pakistan has happened, where, well, first of all, this idea that you can be religious and left-wing is it's considered absurd now, right? Whereas that used to be quite common, right? And you actually had left-wing Maulvis in Pakistan. And so when you had these ideological debates in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it wouldn't just be intellectuals ranged against one another. It would be like the left-wing ulama writing against the right-wing ulama, right? And all of that has changed, and it has changed very much through that the period of the 1980s and then consolidated in the 1990s, right? And that's really comes under, I think, that the umbrella of the effects of the U.S. proxy war in Afghanistan in the 80s and what that opened the door to, right? I mean, Gulf money and Saudi money was already important in Pakistan prior to that. But I think really the Zia era consolidated that relationship. And that connects very clearly to US imperialism too. I mean, when I talk in Pakistan, people often say, the problem for us is not the US, the problem for us is Saudi Arabia. And so I have to sort of play out for them that these two are not unconnected. I mean, the reason why Saudi Arabia, this is a question to ask, right, is that and I ask this of people who really believe that, Islamic militancy or political Islam or Islamic fundamentalism or whatever you want to call it, or now that the current sort of, the sort of technical term to use is Salafi Muslims, right? Like, it's this sort of passe to talk about fundamentalists, now you must talk about Salafi Muslims, right? So, not even Wahhabis, right? So, so it's like, okay, even if your concern is with the spreading of Wahhabization and the spreading of this kind of very narrow, intolerant, Saudi-produced brand of Islam, and you're concerned with Saudi Arabia, even that should make you critical of the US, because Saudi Arabia is only able to do what it does because it has the protective hand of the US, right? If the US wanted, of course it could do what it wanted with Saudi Arabia, but it has its own strange computations about what to do and what not to do, and so it chooses not to withhold its benevolence from Saudi Arabia. But really, you cannot underestimate the influence of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates in spreading this kind of right-wing, narrow, intolerant right-wing ideology.
We just have a few more minutes left. Maybe we'll just take one or two questions more and then conclude.
I'm curious on what influence did the cultural churn in academia have on intellectuals in Pakistan? I'm also thinking about how in the Indian context you have the emergence of subaltern studies and some saying that there's parallels with the Hindu rights.
Mm-hmm.
How would,
You mean in terms of Ashish Nandi's brand of like anti, what is it, enlightenment kind of discourse?
Sumit Sarkar.
That's Sumit Sarkar's critique, right? Yeah, that kind of nativism, basically, right? Really, I think this is part of a larger conversation around. But you're talking about Pakistani academia now, not work on Pakistan sort of here.
Work on Pakistan or Pakistani intellectuals?
You may see the odd sort of dissertation or piece of scholarship on Pakistani culture or sort of these kinds of, deploying these kinds of post-colonial theories or frameworks. But because the overarching interest in Pakistan and therefore which sort of guides the work that gets done on Pakistan is through this narrow security lens, it's really all, so people might use, Foucault, but it will be to talk about militancy. But not in an interesting way, that's the thing, right? It's just so now you're using Foucault to tell me things that you could just have. It really does, there's no value added there for me. I'm not saying that you can't use Foucault. I think you can use Foucault in very productive and interesting ways. The thing actually in Pakistan is that the sort of the will to power and the actual, practice of power is so not subtle that you don't really even need to go to these theories, right? It's so every now and then I feel okay, somebody should see if you can look at the same sort of thing within this framework, and then you're what, how do I do this? It only is interesting if you take something subtle, and hidden and sort of try and draw stuff. Not that you can't find those things in Pakistan, but again, the sort of topics that people tend to gravitate to don't really lend themselves also, I think, to a certain kind of analysis. Maybe it's just the social scientist in me, I don't know. Although I think part of my sort of, critique of the scholarship on Pakistan is that no one is interested in doing that kind of scholarship on Pakistan. No one is interested in popular culture. And so those are the places where you can actually use these theorists, right? I don't know of a single person, and I hope that that is changing, who works on popular culture in Pakistan in an interesting way, right? If people do work on culture, it's like Sufism, right? Because again, that falls very neatly within this sort of paradigm of Islam. So those are the good Sufis, are the good Muslims, and the Wahhabis are the bad Muslims. And so, so you kind of work on, but you can do very interesting stuff on Sufism. And there's, there are little pockets of stuff that emerge every now and then where people are doing interesting things. But by and large, I haven't come across anything. And I think that contributes to sort of making Pakistan appear as if it has no culture, no history, nothing sophisticated or interesting going on beyond militancy, right?
In Pakistan, I found a lot of very progressive politics. So it was kind of, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about like how these types of, or these strands of Islam are reduced to certain politics.
You're absolutely right, and I think this goes back to my response to that gentleman there, which is that there used to be, and perhaps still are, people, and there are, it's true, you run across them in everyday life. They're not prominent on the national level as intellectuals or anything, but they're also, you see fewer and fewer of them, people who were conventionally religious, but also progressive, right? I mean, I grew up in that kind of a household. I did not grow up in, liberal household with its secular trappings. I mean, yes, secular in this everyday fashion where we were brought up to think that everybody was equal regardless of what religious creed that they followed, but that didn't mean that we were not brought up to be religious in a particular kind of way. But that's a very different kind of, religion, and that has changed within my family, over the last 20, 30 years, right? So these overt kind of very, very prescribed, scripted forms of piety become very important because, and this is where I think theoretical work could really sort of add to our understanding and bring out these complexities, is the ways in which, they have become a way to kind of display one's social status, right? So certain kinds of expressions of piety give you social status, right? And this becomes really interesting when you think about what happens if you actually go beyond, again, these very stereotypical ideas about, what a woman's decision to wear a hijab means, right? And this is anecdotal evidence, right? I haven't done any research, but anecdotal evidence in my sort of extended family networks where I know that some young women took the hijab specifically as a way to assert a certain kind of power within the extended family, right? Because being this outwardly pious person gives you authority, right? And in very, secular families, right? So it's that kind of stuff is fascinating to me, and that kind of stuff nobody is interested in sort of, exploring, because within Pakistan it's just all gets this is all Talibanization, right? Which, okay, it's part of a rightward shift, certainly, in Pakistani society, but it's still interesting to see the complex and contradictory ways in which it comes out, right? And the same with Sufism, and, the fact is that once the US state decides that a particular cultural form is part of its ideological, sort of project, I think you can kind of kiss whatever progressive aspects it had goodbye, right? So the minute that the US decided that Sufism and that kind of stuff was the thing to, sort of represented progressive Islam, I mean, you have to start worrying, right, about what's going to happen. So, I mean, the only good part of that was that we got to have this fabulous concert in Union Square in New York City, which was, enabled, which had people like Abda Parveen, but also lesser known fabulous folk artists who would never, ever, ever have been invited through the existing networks, and who would, even if they had been invited, would never have gotten a visa, right? So, You gotta take what you can.
We have time for another question or two.
Since I deal with humanities and not exactly South Asian studies and stuff, I was wondering if these so-called left liberal intellectuals have got some connections with, Progressive Writers Association and writers who were at some point of time associated with that movement.
Which ones are you
People
talking
like,
about?
Manto or Ishmat Chugtai. How do they deal with those writers?
But which left liberal intellectuals are you
The kind
talking
of
about?
intellectuals that you were talking about, just
The ones that
so-called-
the younger ones that are
the
emerging?
younger
Or?
ones
Okay.
Specifically, yeah. How do they deal with those literary works? Do they kind of try to
don't
appropriate some of
actually
it, or
I mean, I think, okay, so the Progressive Writers Association, I think has in some ways, a lot of influence in Pakistan still. Maybe not in terms of their politics necessarily, but certainly for the sort of leading lights, at least, nobody doubts their literary worth and things like that. But I can't speak for these left liberal intellectuals, or I mean, I think it might be too soon to call them intellectuals, because they're sort of, at this point, they're activists, and they themselves are sort of working out the ways that they think and analyze the world. But they're intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, certainly, because they are very active in the sort of battle of ideas within Pakistan and outside. I think that for anybody who has any interest and any attachment to the left wing in Pakistan, you have to, there's no way you can escape the Progressive Writers Association. And not just Manto and Ismat, who were, sort of marginal to it, but really the Marxists, the avowed Marxists that were really at the center of the association. Right? So there was the association and there was the movement, right? And so many people that we associate with the movement, and who actually, precisely because they were not part of the inner circle of Marxists and communists, are the ones that get talked about and read within the South Asia literary scene, right? Or outside of it. So Manto is celebrated, and often celebrated precisely because he claimed that he was not a communist. And, of course, he had a very complicated relationship with his communist friends. They were, and he admitted this himself, they were, at the end of the day, the only ones who came to his aid when he was short of money, when he was fighting with the state, because, his work was constantly proscribed, and he was constantly having to fight these legal battles around obscenity, right? So the interesting thing is that there is also this ideological battle within the academy around the progressive writers, and particularly Manto and Ismat, because they are seen, and interestingly, Faiz in a different way, because it's hard to kind of ignore Faiz's socialism, but people still manage to do that. That's the interesting thing. And when you talk to people, they'll be like, yes, Faiz Saab wasn't really much of an activist. You're like, what are you talking about? The man was like, the Secretary General of the Railway Workers Union. And that didn't just mean that it was a formal title. He spent most of his mornings in the 50s and 60s, at the union office, filling out union cards for workers and talking to them and helping them figure out legal battles. What else does being an activist mean, right? But there's this creation of a persona of Faiz where he is, this romanticized romantic poet, right? And it's interesting that even his, I think probably because Faiz was such a beautiful poet and such an effective poet, and I think effective poetry to a certain degree involves subtlety and sophistication, right? Even though I have a fondness for people like Habib Jalib and Sardar Jafri and Josh, whose politics are always out there, right? And they're always considered to be lesser poets, precisely because their politics are out there. But it becomes very easy to kind of appropriate Faiz in this way, because his style is so gentle, even when he's speaking truth to power, and he's almost always speaking truth to power. So it's very easy to sort of read him and appreciate him, but kind of sideline that side of him.
Use the security lens.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, you also in answer to someone's question, you talked about how socio-cultural perspectives are very few and far between. So I was just wondering if you could lead us with just your 5 key buzzwords of what Pakistan is about in the here and the now. So as a very compliment.
I don't know if I could do that. I'm not known for my brevity, first of all, as you must have noticed by now. I mean, I think that it's not, often people hear me as saying that, what's happening in Pakistan in terms of this rightward shift, whether we're talking about rightward shift in terms of religious conservatism or militancy, or what they are not necessarily talking about, what I mean by a rightward shift, this militarization of Pakistan, is that somehow I'm saying that those are not worthy of scholarship or engagement or debate. I'm not saying that at all. I mean, those are huge problems, and they're huge problems for ordinary people in Pakistan, right? Partly because they bear the brunt of the sort of, not just the Taliban's and the other sectarian outfits' violence, but that they also face the brunt of the state's violence, right? Whether it's being caught literally or metaphorically in the crossfire, or because they also happen to have their own agendas which do not gel with the interests of the military establishment, right? So certainly I think those are, this deep sectarianism within Pakistan is worthy of study. This rightward, the way in which I think this rightward shift has happened is worthy of study, but in more sophisticated ways, right? More nuanced, more sophisticated, more empirical ways, right? And empirical not just in terms of looking at what the Pakistani military has done and what the ISI has done, but looking really at life on the ground, right? Everyday life, like deep ethnographies. And the interesting thing, of course, is that one of the ways in which those of us who are critical of liberal Pakistanis and the liberal discourse in the US are dismissed is that we're ethnographers, So now there's like this idea that ethnography, precisely because it, deals with people's everyday lives, somehow is, I don't know what that means, but it seems to me that it's somehow bad. So you're so narrowly focused on people's everyday lives that you forget the sort of larger. But that's not how ethnography works, right? I mean, people are not living their lives in a vacuum. They're constantly living through those structures of power, right? And often trying to work against those structures of power. So I think those kinds of, ethnographies are very, very important. I think like good, honest, empirical social science research, again, of the sort that we got used to for a while with Hamza Alavi and Hassan Gardezi and people like that, is sorely needed once again. And there are people who are doing interesting stuff, even though they're also doing it through certain kinds of think tanks. But, or actually now there's some spaces which are more like, they produce sort of academic work, but they're not think tanks necessarily, and they're also not, universities or colleges. So there's some interesting work coming out of one particular center in Karachi. I'm misremembering the name of that. But they do that kind of ethnography of Karachi, of parts of Sindh and things like that. So people are doing that. That stuff doesn't necessarily get circulated either, right? So even the interesting stuff that does happen kind of doesn't get circulated. But also, I think it's so necessary to focus on, as part of everyday life, to focus on things like pop culture in Pakistan, and not just, the names that sort of make it big on YouTube or whatever, but just the kinds of things. There's a friend of mine, a young friend of mine actually, is working on rap artists in Pakistan. And he's interviewed a whole bunch of them, and he's in the process of sort of writing that up. And he writes actually he's one of the editors now for Tanqeed, so it's become one of the spaces where you can find some interesting work on Pakistan. Not necessarily long form, but at least there's some platform. And he also writes, he's part of this Ajam Media Collective, which is largely Iranian, but they're trying to sort of, expand the notion of Persianate culture, right? So then that sort of brings Pakistan and parts of India, Indian culture into the mix. So I don't know where his stuff is going to end up, but I'd look out for him in there. So that's interesting, not really something that you think about at all when you're thinking about what's going on in Pakistan, right? So there's all these sort of like underground cultures as well that are at work constantly.